Hey folks, Tim Newman with Soft Lite Studios coming to you once again from Columbus, Ohio, where we're staying indoors, dry, mostly safe and coronavirus free. Hey, today we're bringing to you part 2 in our series Lightroom to Photoshop round trip editing. And today we're going to look at how that interaction between Lightroom and Photoshop is controlled, so you have a specific understanding of the steps that are being taken there, and it probably will provide some clarification into files that all of a sudden don't have layers anymore as PSD files, and that's certainly a good thing to understand. This will be part 2 in our series. As I said, part 3 and 4 will be coming probably yet this week, but this ought to keep you going for today. Take a look. When we last finished off in this video series on Lightroom to Photoshop round trip editing, we had just finished doing our global edits to this picture here in this Lightroom catalog, and we were getting ready to send this picture on off to Photoshop for some localized edits. Now, how Photoshop receives this picture and ultimately how this picture comes back to us is all a byproduct of our preferences settings in our Lightroom installation. And we want to take a quick look at those because they are going to control what the results are that we see here in this set of exercises. So we can find the preferences menu on a Mac system under the Lightroom menu up here. So you can see under Lightroom Classic, there are preferences. If you are on a Windows machine, you would go up to the Edit menu in Lightroom, and under the Edit menu, you would find the Preferences dialog box. Now, in this dialog box, we want to make sure that we are on the External Editing tab. And this External Editing tab is where we're going to make sure that we have settings set up that we want. Now, there are really 4 settings here that we care about. There's a 5th one that pops up if we flip over to the TIFF file type, which is compression, which quite frankly doesn't really even matter these days like it used to. And then there's PSD, which takes us back to 4 settings. So we're going to cover each of these settings kind of at a high level and then move on. If you need in-depth background behind some of these concepts here, I would recommend that you look in the description below and you'll find links pointing you to our color theory, color space, and color management video series, as well as our color settings in Photoshop video series, and both of those really explain color theory and management in great detail, and I would recommend that you go there to get that level of background. So we can ask for Photoshop to send us back the file in one of 2 ways. So it really doesn't matter what we're sending over. We could be sending over a RAW file, a JPEG, a TIFF, whatever the Lightroom supports as a file type. Once we are done with Photoshop and we say, okay, save this and head back to Lightroom, we're either going to get back a TIFF or a PSD. And quite frankly, capability-wise, they're almost identical to one another in that they support multiple layers and they support alpha channels, etc. Really, the primary difference between the two is TIFF files are more efficient in terms of loading speed and file size, but PSD files offer all sorts of layer compatibility to other Adobe applications, not to mention other third-party applications as well. So if you plan on taking your file off to other applications and interrogating the layer structure of them, then probably keeping PSD files as your file format coming back out of Photoshop makes the most sense. If you're simply in a round trip, I'm taking pictures and editing them and bringing them back to Lightroom process for subsequent export and either sharing on the web or printing, then the TIFF file is probably the way for you to go. Now, I do a lot of video editing in other Adobe apps, so I stick with PSDs, but that's an easy thing for you to decide. Now, color space, I don't want to go into huge depth here on color space because our color theory color management, color spaces video series does that really well. But suffice it to say, sRGB is the smallest color space. Adobe RGB is the one that's in the middle, if you will, and ProPhoto RGB is a really big color space. It gives us lots of capabilities. Now, whether you know it or not, Lightroom uses a derivative of the ProPhoto RGB color space for all of the files that it's managing anyways. So I think my opinion of that is it's best to stay in that color space and work in that color space all the way along and save your downsample to other color spaces, for example, sRGB for the web or Adobe RGB 1998 for print until export time. And Photoshop's really great at that. The other thing that we're interested in here is bit depth per component. And really this, in my estimation, should say bit depth per channel. So if we're working on a RGB document, a red, green, blue document, we have 3 channels, right? So then we would have 16 bits for the red channel, subsequently 16 bits for the green channel and 16 bits for the blue channel. These values just speak to color capacity in a document, not color gamut or range, like which colors are too bright, which ones are not that bright, or in other words, outputtable or not outputtable, depending on the device. This just speaks to raw capacity in terms of how many colors we can possibly hold. Now, there's a lot of debate about this, but I'm again in the camp of, unless you have some kind of hardware constraint, 16 bits per component / channel gives you a tremendous amount of capability that 8 bits doesn't. And I tend to like working there. And again, I can always downsample at export time. Last but not least, resolution, and this resolution here is in pixels per inches. Now, there's some differing philosophies here. My philosophy here is pretty straight simple. I always work at print resolution, which for me is this 300 pixels per inch. If I need a lower resolution file, for example, at 132 pixels per inch for web content, or 72 pixels per inch for something that I'm going to use in a video production, again, I'm downsampling that at export time. So I think the theme that you'll hear from me overall here and makes sense to me in my workflow is work as large as you can, downsample at export time. You can always, at that point, crunch down the file size for the target output device that you're going to. So these are the settings that are important here. And really, what you want to take away from this is these dictate the file type that you're going to get back when you come back out of Photoshop. Because if you send over a JPEG file or a RAW file or a TIFF file, you're not going to get those back from this editing process. With these settings, no matter what I send over, I'm getting back a PSD file in this color space with this bit depth at this resolution, and it will be stacked next to the original in the film strip, which we'll see here in a little bit. Now that we understand the specifics of the interaction between Lightroom and Photoshop, and we know where to control that, let's go ahead and get out of that Preferences dialog box. That will take us back over into Lightroom, where you can see our photo is waiting for us, and we can now think about taking it into Photoshop. There are a number of ways to get a photo from Lightroom into Photoshop. First is you can come up here to the Lightroom menu and you can do Photo Edit In, and you can see Edit in Adobe Photoshop 2020 is our first choice here in this menu, and our first choice would be whatever our first external editor is as specified in the settings dialog box that we just looked at. We can also come down into the picture itself. We can right click here. You see another Edit in menu here with the exact same choices. We can right click on the picture and we get the same choices here. So there are lots of different ways to get to it. But I find by far the easiest way to get to it is to use the Command-E shortcut key on the Mac or Control-E shortcut key on Windows. Now that'll even load Photoshop for you, as you can see here. So that's exactly what it's doing. It just loaded the application, and now it's loaded up the picture. And I'm going to go ahead and do a Command-0 on the Mac to make this fit full size into the tabbed interface. That's a Control-0 on Windows. And if we look up here at the tabbed interface, we can see that indeed we are getting ready to edit this RAW file, which is what was sent from Lightroom to Photoshop. We are in the RGB color mode, makes sense. We are at 16-bit bit depth, that's what we asked for. And if we come up here to the edit menu in Photoshop and we look at assign profile, we'll see that in fact our profile that we're currently using is ProPhoto RGB, which is exactly what we asked for. So everything that we requested for Lightroom to do for us going into Photoshop, it's done. So now what I'd like to do is I'm going to make a couple of edits, and I'm going to make them as kind of ugly, obvious edits, but there's a reason for doing this, which I hope you'll follow along with. I'm going to come over here to the Layers Control panel, and I'm going to click on the New Layer icon, and then I'm going to jeter over here to the color picker, and I like that red. I'm going to make sure the paintbrush tool is active. This is the tool right there. If it's not active, I can just hit the B key. You notice I'm cycling through all of the different brushes, but that's the paintbrush tool I want. I don't specifically care about the size, just something that you can draw in the picture. Now, as you're looking at this, you can see that we've put that in its own separate layer, so it's not on the background layer with the picture itself. And I'm going to do this one more time. I'm going to click on the Create a New Layer icon again. I'm going to come over here to the color picker, and I'm going to go with a nice kind of fluorescent yellow and paint a stripe on with that. And you can see once again that is sitting on its own layer, and so we can easily turn off these really wonderful edits that we just did. So there, I've got a couple of edits that I've done here. If I want to close this document out and save it at the same time, usually the easiest thing to do is a Command W on a Mac. That is a Control W on Windows. It knows that the file hasn't been saved yet, so it asks you, do you want to save it? You say, why, yes, I do. And you can see down here in the lower left-hand corner that document is in fact saving for us. And in a second, when that's done, we'll pop on over into Lightroom. In fact, we don't even have to wait. We can head over now. So there we are back in Lightroom. And you can see our edited photo is now back here in Lightroom. And as we had indicated, it is stacked in the film strip right next to its original. So you can see, especially looking here at the file name, there's the original Sony RAW file, and if I go one to the left, you see that we now see that it's a PSD file, but we also see this dash edit in here, which is a part of the naming standard that Photoshop uses for bringing edited photos back from Photoshop. It puts that dash edit in there. In fact, the dash edit will get repeated as many times as you edit the file. Now, real quickly, we said this is a part of a stack, so if we hit the E key to go back to the library module, or click on library, either one, but I like E as a shortcut key, and I hit the S key, you will notice that down here, that stack opens and closes. So if you edit a photo, 10 times or so, you can have them all stacked there together, and then the last one will always be on the top of the stack, which is kind of nice. So now what we want to do is I'm going to open this stack back up, and I would like to take this and edit it in Photoshop again. So I'm going to execute that exact same shortcut key, that Command E on Mac, Control E on Windows. And now you notice that things have really changed up here. We've got a totally different dialog box than we had the first time when we edited the picture. So let's talk about this. I want you to pay particular attention to this, not the Shiba Inu that's hopped up in my lap while I was working on this video. I mean, she deserves attention too, but that's not the concept that we're trying to cover here. I want you to pay particular attention to what's about to happen here, because from the standpoint of editing, we're about to diverge really an editing path. You have a choice. You can add in more Lightroom edits and bring those Lightroom edits, or you can do nothing and bring it back over and edit more in Photoshop. Now you notice when I was talking about my workflow, what I said was I go into Lightroom, I do my cropping, my white balance, and my basic global adjustments that I feel are necessary, and then I'm done developing in Lightroom. I don't usually do any more development steps in Lightroom at that point. It gets handed off into Photoshop, and I use Photoshop to complete the remainder of the edits. And this is one of the reasons why I want you to watch what happens here. If I say, let's edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments, it's going to go ahead and open that up, and sure enough, if you come over here, you can see our yellow stripe and our bright red stripe are still there. But there's an important difference, and that is if you look over at the background layer, you'll quickly note that that's the only layer. that our two individual layers that we created when we were last over here are gone. Well, they're not really gone. They've been flattened. So when you choose to bring over additional Lightroom edits, Lightroom flattens out any layers that are currently in that Photoshop file because it can't keep track of both. It can't allow you to have those separate layers that have been added in and those Lightroom edits. It just doesn't understand how to apply both of those at the same time. So I'm going to just Command W out of here real quick, and it's asking me if I want to save it. I'm going to say don't save it. I haven't made any changes, so I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to come back over here into Lightroom, and I'm going to go ahead and do, on this same picture, a Command E to tell it I want to go over to Photoshop one more time. And you'll notice I get the same dialog box. Now what I want to do is I want to take a look at the secondary choices here, which is edit a copy or edit the original. So if I edit the original, I'm going to be editing that file right there. And that edit original that I'm going to bring up, any changes I make are going to be written back to that file. If I don't want to do that and I'm concerned that I'd like to keep some history here, then edit a copy is a better choice because it will bring the picture over. No Lightroom adjustments that have been made to this version of the file will come along. This is irrespective of what's happened here. And as you can see here in a second, the layers will be maintained. So anytime that you use edit original or edit copy, you're going to still have your layers intact in the PSD file. Anytime you say edit original with Lightroom adjustments, it's going to flatten out what's there and bring the Lightroom adjustments in with it. So you want to be cognizant of that because that makes a real difference in the editing process here. And if I go ahead, let's say, and just turn this layer off, I'm going to do a Command W, and I'm going to go ahead and save this, and we'll hop back over into Lightroom. It'll catch up with us soon enough. You'll notice in a minute here, we're going to have another copy of this, and it'll take us a second to update, but we should see a copy without our green stripe on. There we go. You can see that when we went over, Lightroom made the copy that we asked it to make, so it made a copy of the file, and then as it exited Photoshop, it overwrote that file with the newest version. And you'll notice, last but not least, over here our file name is still the same original prefix and number sequence that was here, but now there's a dash edit in here 2 times, plus the PSD extension, indicating that this file has been edited twice, and it's been an edit of the original that has come over this way, or an edit of a copy that has come over this way, not an edit with the Lightroom adjustments. And if we load this up one more time just to confirm the operation of this with the Command D again, and I say, hey, let's edit another copy, you'll see when we open this back up, because we're still using that edit original or edit copy and not the version with Lightroom adjustments, that we have our layers intact here again. In fact, I could add in another layer, and I could come over here and say, you know, I think this time a really nice bright fuchsia would work really good here. And then we'll do our Command W on the Mac, Control W on Windows. Let's go ahead and save this one. We're going to pop back over here into Lightroom. You can see here's our copy. Hasn't quite updated yet because Photoshop's still saving in the background. But in a second, we'll see this update and our little fuchsia stripe will show up there. So there you go. And as I said, these are all still stackable, which is kind of nice. And you can use the S key to open and close that stack at any point you want. Now look at for a separate video from us. We'll probably post this the next few days that just talks about stacking and grouping in Lightroom in the library module and some of the features of that, because I think that's a good one to add into our list this week. So there you have it. There's the interaction between Lightroom and Photoshop when you're sending pictures over to Photoshop to be edited. I think it's important that we differentiated between that edit original with Lightroom adjustments and then our edit copy or edit original options, because then you can understand what's happening to the layers depending on which one you choose. I'm really pretty cautious about, I do what I described in the beginning, cropping white balance, my global adjustments, and then I'm done. I don't do any more with developed features in Lightroom. It's all Photoshop from there on out, so I don't have to worry about the edit original with Lightroom adjustments and the flattening out of my layers. I'm very cautious about that, especially if I'm working on something that's really complex. And it's not unusual to have a document that's got 50 layers in it, 100 layers in it. I mean, if you really get into compositing and doing graphics and stuff like that, it takes no time at all to ramp up to a document that's that size. So I'm real careful about that's my workflow. So we'll be back at you pretty quickly with the next video in the series, and I'm going to go through and talk about some of the edits that I typically do in Photoshop. Now that part could go on and on quite a bit, so I'm going to keep it fairly high level. And then in the last part of the series, I'm going to just take a real quick high level view at the export module and presets that I use to get resulting output out and get it ready for the web with a watermark, get it ready for the web without a watermark, get it prepared to send to one of my printers or off to a print bureau, so you can see the final step in this entire cycle of working back and forth between Lightroom and Photoshop. I hope you found this information useful. If you haven't watched the first video go back and watch it. I'll put the link in the description below. And then keep an eye out for the next two installations in this, because I think there's going to be some good stuff in there. And by the time I'm done with that, you'll have a real good idea of how I work through these two applications and really leverage them in my workflow. In the meantime, I hope you're staying safe and you're staying healthy, and you're chomping at the bit to get back out there and do some photography. I know I am. And the one thing that we keep saying, and it's in the back of our minds and in our hearts here all the time, which is learning equals skills, practice equals mastery. We'll see you out there, hopefully soon.